Hey, and we are live. All right, this night's class, we're talking about cooking for Shabbos and reheating foods. I showed everybody the syllabus for tonight's class, so we're going to use that one. This is cooking food for Shabbos, titled Bishul and Ofeh, and the reason why I listed it as Bishul and Ofeh is because at some point everyone should really learn exactly how Shabbos and Malachas work. There's basically um, the concept of malacha is that there's a process that will occur in the Mishkan and the tabernacle, and that process listed in the Mishnah as a malacha, meaning it's listed as a forbidden labor category of labor on Shabbos, and that official category listed in the Mishnah is called Ofeh. Ofeh means to bake, because the Mishkan was used to bake bread. He used to bake breads for every Shabbos. They put it on that little golden table that was inside of the Holy of Holies. Every single week they would take down the old bread, the Kohanim would eat it, make a new one. Bishul is what would be called basically the Av Malacha. It is essentially the same one. You take the raw item and you cook it. We're going to talk about that now. What we're going to talk about is what these things are, this process of cooking and baking, and how to avoid doing it on Shabbos. And also, again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to put the question onto the group chat that's on the side over here. And I'll be referencing it throughout. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about over here is there's actually a fairly obvious source for the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos in the Torah. This is not what Chazal lists, not what the rabbis of the Talmud list as the source of it, but it is a fairly obvious source that the Jewish people in the desert do not really cook. So on their exodus from Egypt, they left Egypt and they would receive man every day, the manna every single morning, but on Fridays they would receive double portion. And so it says that they would give it either cooked, and they would receive a double portion, and it would be either cooked or baked, and they would save it, have part of a meal that night, another meal the next day, and they weren't allowed to leave it raw going to the next day because otherwise it would spoil. So there was a clear command to bake what you wanted to bake and cook what you wanted to cook the day before. Shabbos. So on Fridays you would get the double portion. Okay, and so if you look in the first section over here. There is a difference between cooking and baking, and in terms of the process is different. So by baking, the process is to take something and basically apply heat to it in a dry form. So you have lots of heat, you intensify it in a space, and then you cook it, and then you bake it. Okay, so baking is similar to roasting. They're very similar. It's a dry application of heat. It's all transferred through the air or directly from the fire. And so that is what baking is. So things like bread are baked, and things like meats and so on that are grilled are baked. They are done dry. There's no need for water to cause it to change form. So the process of baking is a primary process of changing an object from one state to another. So you take raw dough, turn it to bread, take raw meat, turn it to steak, so on and so forth. That would be the process of Ofeh. That would be the process of baking. Okay. Cooking, on the other hand, would be transforming the food item using a liquid to transform its state. Okay. So what it basically means is that you take a pot, you put water or other liquid, you would heat it using the fire, and then and then you would put something else in it to change its form. So let's say it started off as raw dough, and now you throw it. Instead of baking it, you're now going to cook it by throwing it into boiling water. So you have a different process for achieving your dough to be not raw anymore. You're now cooking it. So for example, like a dumpling has different texture than that of a bureka, for example. So bureka is a tough pastry. You bake it, it gets all fluffy and flaky, but they won't do that in water. So these two processes are two different things, and it's important to know that these are both processes that accomplish a similar goal, not the same goal. Just know that there's different issues. So, for example, if you were to increase the heat on something that was cooked, you would achieve a different texture. For example, a bagel. The process of making a bagel is you boil water, you throw the raw dough in, and you cook the outside of it. So that would be a very gooey texture to it. Then you take it out of the water and you put it onto you put on these little boards, and these boards you bake on the board, and it puffs up and fluffs up and becomes a bagel. If you don't cook it at first, you don't kill the yeast, and if you were to bake it straight without cooking it first, you would have this gigantic bagel. It would be like 2-3 times the size of your own head, right? Well, that would be useless if you want to have bagel and cream cheese in the morning. Well, I mean, it would everyone to have bagel and cream cheese in that morning, but not a whole bagel. And so the cooking is a necessary process that affects a different change in the object. So same thing too. If you were to take let's say take meat, a lot of times you would meat. You brown it first. You sear the outside. That makes the outside brown. And then you go ahead and cook it. That would be a different process. That process would then be you basically use a raw process to get the desired effect on the outside, and then you could cook it the rest of the way. There's a process that they use, I believe, in hotels that does something like that. We basically, I think it's called sous vide or something like this. What you do is in hotels, when they want to close the kitchen and you want to order a steak at 2 o'clock in the morning, the kitchen never closes. So the way they give you a decent looking meal at that time is the chef will take a steak, and he'll grill it on two sides. He'll go with the very nice grill lines. And they'll put it in a vacuum sealed pack, and they'll have this big kettle that they cook the soups in and stuff like that. Well, they can just take the steak, throw in the kettle, and cook it up the rest of the way. So you have a nice hot steak. It looks like it was a grilled steak, but really it's a steak soup is really what it was. And that is the process. That is a totally different process. Okay. So next thing I want to talk about is obviously when we cook food, there's different levels of cooking it, and talk about how this impacts having food ready for Shabbos or not. So there's basically the first level I would like to call raw. Raw means that you either just killed the animal, you just mixed the dough, you just mixed the cake. The heat and the object haven't ever met each other. That's raw, for all intents and purposes. Okay, and then there's this space that's in between raw and partially cooked, like where it's barely edible. If you look on the syllabus, it's called Machal ben Drusai. Ben Drusai was a notorious thief in the times of the Talmud, and and he used to cook his food really fast. That way he could continue to flee from the authorities. But clearly, what he was doing was sufficient to make the food edible, and therefore it was considered a fair demarcation point of food being considered partially cooked. There's actually a machlokas rishonim. There's a dispute amongst early rabbis in the basically medieval era as to whether or not this means it satisfies cooking it part of the way. It means that it satisfies the Torah's condition of something being cooked. So if you were to cook it further, you're no longer violating a Torah prohibition or not. The Shulchan Aruch takes the stringent opinion that it is not. However, there is a fairly strong opinion that of Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, who lived about a couple hundred years after Maimonides, and was definitely would have been seen by the Shulchan Aruch himself, who says that no, food cooked in Ma'achal ben Drusai is considered cooked, and cooking beyond that point on Shabbos wouldn't violate a Torah prohibition, but there's still a rabbinic prohibition to cook it any further. And as we'll continue to talk about that in a second, this is going to have implications. We'll talk about this class, talk about another class, which we didn't know about it now, is that Ma'achal ben Drusai has implications for food be allowed to be left on the fire to continue cooking into Shabbos. Just put that in your back pocket right now. Note there's a concept of partially cooked. It doesn't mean partially cooked, right? So it doesn't mean that's something that's barely edible. So was this something that depended on the type of food or not? And did it depend? What it was dependent on? So this is a rhetorical question. I know the answer to it. Ma'achal ben Drusai was either food that was 1/3 of the way cooked or 1/2 way cooked. It's a dispute between Rashi and the Rambam, and it doesn't matter who says what. What's important to know is that 1/3 suffices for our purposes for food to be cooked part of the way in order to let it continue cooking into Shabbos. And that's just an important thing to know. There was a concern, which we'll talk about more in a second. There's a concern that people might come to stoke their coals to cook food faster, which in our day and age is only important if you want to barbecue. And everybody knows that barbecuing is a very important part of a very good dinner. So it's not like this is not pertinent anymore. However, it doesn't necessarily apply to our consistent source of heat for things like electric ranges or for gas stoves. But still, these halachas still do apply, and so to allow food to continue cooking into Shabbos, if you already started cooking it, you preferably should have it cooked at least 1/3 of the way. 1/3 of the way means if this is a food that normally, wherever it is, would normally take 60 minutes to fully cook, then if you cook it for 20, it's cooked 1/3 of the way. Right? If it's normally going to take 9 hours to cook, if it's cooked for 3 hours, right, then it's considered cooked 1/3 of the way. And you can figure out the math for half the way. Preferably, they suggest to do half or 1/3. And we'll talk about other suggestions about how to prepare for Shabbos later on. Okay. The next level of cooking after 1/3 is all the way. So there's this other intermediate stage between 1/3 and 1/2 to come fully cooked. Fully cooked pretty much obviates the need for a blech on Shabbos, but we use one anyway, so that there was no concern. The rabbis were not concerned that if you fully cooked food before Shabbos that you're going to try to get it super hot on Shabbos, that whatever leftover amount of heat you had would suffice to keep food hot for the night meal. And so therefore they established a category known as Mevushal Cold Sorfo, which is in 3 over here under section A, that was fully cooked. The question was if additional cooking may or may not improve the quality of the food. For our Sephardic friends, this can be a problem. For those of us following Ashkenazi practice, it doesn't actually make a difference. But just know that there was a category. There's a category where things are fully cooked, which allows for certain other leniencies. Just so keep that in your back pocket for right now. That there's these separate categories. You have raw. You have third cooked, called Ma'achal ben Drusai, which means that it's barely edible. Then Mevushal Kol Tzorcho, where it's fully cooked. And we're going to see how these different types of cooking interact in terms of the process of getting ready for Shabbos. It really gets a lot easier after this. So the question is, what if you want to keep food hot? Well, if you just want to insulate it. There is a process known as hatmana of insulating. There were some issues, again, that the rabbis of the Talmud were concerned that, again, the whole stoking coals and all that fun stuff, trying to keep food hot, you would increase the heat source. So basically, the easiest way around it is to never ever fully wrap your food to keep it hot for Shabbos. The problem is that if you fully wrap your food, which means that, for example, if you were to take something, you take your pot and wrap it around the sides and over the top, and then on the bottom you put the heat source, or even furthermore, you immerse your pot in your heat source, like a crock pot, and then cover the top with something else on it, that would be insulating. That would be hatmana, and that would not be permitted because in the days of the Talmud, they would basically take the coals and pour it on top of the pot to keep it super hot for the nighttime. And so, in order to avoid people thinking they could do that, they disallowed using fabrics and other such things that increase the temperature and that insulate it, because they didn't want people to, again, make use of coals for the same purpose. So they disallowed it. So what you can do to keep things hot, to insulate for Shabbos, is to either put something across the top that's a fabric without touching the sides of the pots. If you have a few pots and pans on top of your blech, you can put fabric across the top. And yes, Esther. You may. Let's talk about it later. Thank you. That we call a shear bomb, class bomb. And so to go ahead and cover it over the top, or if you just cover the sides without covering the top, that would be permitted as well. So modern crock pots aren't a problem because the top is uncovered. There, at some point, developed some people will tell you that there are problems with crock pots on Shabbos. Just if they bring that up, come see me, and I will expand on the wonderful halachic difficulties of crock pots. But that will be not for tonight. Unless somebody wants to ask about that. Thank you for asking. Okay. Moving on with number 5 over here, cooking with edible raw foods, water, and non-foods. So things like fruits or vegetables, these things are susceptible to being cooked. So you couldn't, for example, take raw celery and throw it in a pot on Shabbos, or take a raw apple and leave it on the blech, because it's still possible to take heat and make changes to it. So it's not only about taking something raw, making it fully cooked, but also taking things that were raw and changing it to make an improvement. In fact, the real question is like things that aren't improved at all technically shouldn't be having a problem with cooking. So, for example, if you just use, for example, how could you leave a piece of metal on the fire all Shabbos long? You're cooking the metal and so on and so forth. Does your metal have to be cooked all the way and things like that? So the rules with that don't apply with non-food. So things like metal or ceramic, these things don't have a problem like food objects do, with having a problem with cooking. But it's still sort of just important to know that, for example, if you had a filament that was metal and you use that, if you excited that filament to generate light, let's say like in a light bulb or anything else, filament being a metal, like mercury is a metal, would be a problem of basically at least cooking it, because you run energy through it and you change it and so on and so forth. And at a certain point it does exhaust it, burns it out, and it pops. So like light bulbs could be one of the problems suggested of turning on a light bulb on Shabbos is that you are basically cooking the filament itself, and raising temperature above Yad Salatus Bo, and even more so than Yad Salatus Bo is that you're physically changing it, you're exciting it to a new level. But the truth is that for things like metals, you actually have to heat them to a point where they actually become soft, or even become a coal of some kind, where that you could take that metal like an element, like a heating element, and then heat up something else. That would be a significant change on Shabbos, heating it to red hot. So those type of things would be cooking on Shabbos. Just know that it's there. It's not really going to be pertinent unless you're trying to heat up metal. Try not to heat up metal on Shabbos. Try not to heat up ceramics on Shabbos to a point where they would change. So if you're going to use ceramics, make sure they've already been finished, in a kiln and so on, and try not to put Play-Doh on the blech and those type of things. Other than that, there's really nothing else I can think of that would be a practical issue with that. If you can think of one, let me know. Something interesting with water is that when you cook water for Shabbos, there is no Ma'achol ben Drusai. There's no idea of being 1/3 cooked. Water should preferably be boiled all the way before Shabbos. And so if you're setting up an electric urn, try to set it up a little bit ahead of Shabbos, so that way it's boiled up and ready to go. And some people also suggest that if you have a pump pot or anything else, that you also pump the water through one time after it's been heated, because sometimes the water that's in the actual system is colder than the water that's inside. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not sure that it is. You could test yours out and see if that's the case. But nonetheless, if you just run it through one time, that's fine. If you forget, don't worry about it. It's probably hot enough anyway. Okay. The last section over here talking about cooking is that obviously when you cook something, the question is there something that means you can cook it again, right? You've already cooked it all the way. Is there a concept of cooking it again, or you're reheating it? So we're in section 6 over here. There is a concept of that can be an issue, which is that certain types of things that certain types of foods can benefit from further cooking or from having other types of cooking. Like we mentioned before, that you get different results with different types of foods. So things to be concerned about are bishul achar bishul, which is cooking it again. So if you have a soup that gets cold, the Sephardic tradition has a much more stringent view than Ashkenazic. Okay, actually, I'm sorry I missed your question from before. I'll get back to that at the end of the class. So if you're cooking it, so cooking it again would be to basically, so the Sephardic tradition has it that if the liquid drops below Yad drops below a real hot temperature, your hand jumps back from it, you can't heat it up anymore. Ashkenazi tradition allows you to be more lenient, that if it drops down below that temperature, it's okay, you can still heat it up again. Both of them agree that if it's totally cold and you have a liquid, getting the liquid hot again is considered a new benefit on Shabbos, is considered cooking it again, and you shouldn't do that again. There were early rabbis who felt that there was no such concept, that once you cook it, you can't cook it again. So, for example, I believe that there are Yemenite Jews out there who take their soup out of their fridge on Shabbos, put it on the plata for Shabbos day, and heat it up. That way they have hot soup. Again, the Yemenite Jews are allowed to do such a thing because they follow the opinion of Maimonides on every single detail. If you're not sure if you're Yemenite, just ask your parents. So and if they're not sure, ask somebody else. So the second one over here is bishul achar afiyah. So we talked about this before, that you would get different results as a result of cooking and baking. That the results on the food have different effects on it. So, for example, if you grilled a steak, you really shouldn't throw your steak into your soup pot on Shabbos to get it hot, because you're going to be cooking your steak, and cooking it has a different effect on the meat than grilling it or baking it does. Obviously, there's the fluid dynamics that go on as the water goes in and goes out. It has different effects on it. And so, for example, let's say like you had cold matzo balls, right? Matzo balls, you cooked them, and you had cold matzo balls, and you needed extra matzo balls for Shabbos. You didn't remember, and all of a sudden, 3 more people show up for Shabbos, because that happens a lot. You're just hanging out at home, and boom, somebody shows up to your Shabbos table. You may need more matzo balls to the soup, and you had extra ones, because everyone has extra matzo balls too. And so you take your extra matzo balls, and you can throw them right into the soup pot that's been taken off the fire. I'll talk about that in a second. And you can throw that right in there, which you couldn't with the steak, but the matzo balls have been cooked already, so you could do that. That would be perfectly fine. Okay, so just to give you an idea of issues like that. And the other thing is that there are other types of cooking, like frying or fire roasting and barbecuing. Frying is an iffy category, because it's kind of dry, it's kind of wet. There's deep frying, which is like cooking. But basically, you should try to not, if something is fried, for example, if you fried French fries or fried chicken, something like this, you shouldn't treat them as cooked. You should treat them as something that's neither baked nor cooked. Treat them as some intermediate intermediate level. This way, you know, you should try not to put it on the fire or on the blech where it's too hot, where it might toast something. And also, there's the issue of, for example, with bread, you shouldn't put it in near a heat source where it would actually toast the bread, because you are making a further cooking process on the bread. Okay. Any questions on cooking processes? Okay, you'll be testing this out later, so don't worry about it. Okay. All right. So what we're going to talk about next is the second section over here. Yes.
So I think I'm not getting the concept of not reheating it directly from cold. So is it, you know, take it out of the refrigerator, let the coolness come down, let it kind of sit at room temperature, and then heat it? Is it a 3-step process that way?
Those are good questions. I think this next section will answer that question for you, though.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of overlap, because when I'm talking about like how far things are cooked and so on is pertinent not only to what cooking is, but also to when we talk about shehiyah and chazara in the next class in a couple of weeks. We talk about leaving food to finish cooking, or if it's cooked and you want to put it back to keep it hot. There'll be some overlap. So let's go through the second section. I think that'll answer a bunch of your questions.
Okay.
All right, so this next section is called Hot Foods, Hot Liquids, and How They May Be Used on Shabbos. Okay, we're going to talk about the different levels of heat transfer now. All right, so this is our physics lesson, Shabbos physics lesson, in terms of how these different heats move and are related to each other. They also relate in laws of kashrus too, like if something's still hot from being on the fire, if it's in a second container, and so on. So these types of concepts have multiple applications. Okay, so in section 2 over here about hot foods and hot liquids, the first thing is Clich Rishon al ha'esh. Okay, this is the original pot where you're cooking the food that is still on the fire. Okay, so you've made a pot of soup, and it's a rolling boil, and you've left it on top of the fire. And let's talk about it being ready for Shabbos. So you have either a plata or a blech. And remember, there's a plata and a blech. The blech is that sheet of metal. You just leave it on top of a flame that's on, preferably on the back corner of your stove top, and you could leave your pot right on top of that flame. That blech is basically there to prevent the rabbinic violation of leaving food on the flame. But we're going to assume over here we do it anyway. We always put a blech on, no matter what. We always have a plata up. But let's assume that you always need it, even though the actual halacha says you don't. Okay? So, but this way, if you have it there, you can always take the food off and put it back on. So it still has a use anyway. So that original pot is in the corner on top of the flame, keeping it hot. Okay? So that is what's called Clich Rishon al ha'esh. All right? So we'll go through all the different types of heat states, and then talk about where the different foods that we just talked about can go into those different types of kelim. Okay, the next level is Clich Rishon shehusar mi'esh. Okay, Clich Rishon, the original pot. Okay, husar means to be removed mi'esh, from the fire. All right, so you have the soup. So first level was soup pot on the fire. Now you've taken it off the fire. Okay, you've actually gone down a level. It's not as bad as Clich Rishon al ha'esh. Okay. The next level after that is if you ever want to know, by the way, if I give really great directions, right? When people would ask me directions how to get to places, I'd always say, okay, you go down 4 traffic lights. You will see, a Dunkin' Donuts on the corner, right? If you pass at Dunkin' Donuts, you've gone too far, right? So that's kind of like what we're doing here. We're talking about Clich Rishon. It's kind of like the way I give directions, right? You will not miss it because you're going to look for these different signs along the way, as opposed to just GPS, which is like 250 feet, like plus 50 feet. Okay? So The C over here is third level here is Irui Kli Rishon. This is food poured from the original pot into a container. No, it doesn't mean ladling out. Ladling out, we'll talk about in a second. Irui Kli Rishon literally means food poured, and there's an important difference, and we'll talk about that in a second. Kli Sheni. Kli Sheni is the utensil where the hot food is now placed. So you took it off the fire, right? You had your pot on the fire, you took it off the fire, you've now poured it into another container, like a bowl, okay? That bowl is Kli Sheni, okay? That's where the food has now gone. A ladle is somewhere between these two categories, either Irui Kli Rishon or Kli Sheni, okay? And it's a dispute. So we'll talk about that when I finish all of these over here. But a ladle is somewhere in between there, because Kli Sheni isn't really poured out of a Kli Rishon, it's taken from it, and the Kli Sheni had food land in it from a hot one, so it itself was cold when the things land into it, so that can reduce the amount of heat and intensity of the heat since the walls of it are colder. But a ladle goes into the pot, so it's similar but different. Okay. And the third category is Kli Shlishi. Kli Shlishi is a wonderful halacha concept that was first conceived about 100 years ago and only put in practice about 50 years ago, when people couldn't decide what was considered food that would cook in a Kli Sheni in the second vessel. Which again, I'll explain this in just a second. It's a third possible occasion for you've taken food out of the pot, you put it in a bowl, and now you put it in another bowl. Okay, and usually the only time you need a Kli Shlishi is for making tea. So we'll get to that right now. Okay, this is section F. So this is where we learn how to do all kinds of fun stuff. Okay, so we don't want to cook anything on Shabbos, right? Okay. So let's say your Kli Rishon al ha'esh is a fully cooked matzo ball soup, because you can't have Shabbos without matzo ball soup, right? Good, got to all agree on that. Okay, so at least for our purposes, we're all agree on that. Now let's go back to our matzo balls for a second. Okay, so you have the extra matzo balls, and you want to heat up the extra matzo balls. Okay, you can't take the matzo balls from the freezer or the fridge and throw them into a Kli Sheni that's on the fire, right? You can't do that. You can't do that. Not because it's not a Torah prohibition because everything's fully cooked. It's a rabbinic prohibition that you cannot agitate a pot that's on the fire. So, for example, you can't even stir the pot. You should preferably not even serve from it if it's sitting on top of the fire, and you definitely can't throw cold foods into it because it looks exactly like cooking. So you're not allowed to do anything that looks like that on Shabbos. There is an exception, which is, let's say a lot of people have crock pots that I don't know if they make this anymore. They used to. You couldn't take the pot out of the slow cooker itself. You have to serve directly from the pot. So there's one opinion who says you can't do that. So according to that opinion, which is the Kolbo, you can't use that crock pot on Shabbos. You should just take it outside and smash with a sledgehammer. Or if you don't have a sledgehammer, you take it back to the store, whichever one is more fun. So, it would be work. Sledgehammer is way more fun. Okay, right, glad we agree on that. All right. So, or you can use it during the week. I didn't think about that as possibilities. I don't know why you use your slow cooker during the week, but anyway. Do you use slow cookers during the week? You do use slow cookers during the week, right? You could put food in it in the morning, come back, have food later. That sounds awesome. Like Chalk all week long. Get Chalk factory in your own house. Okay. What? I'm sorry. I tried to get back to my ADD moment. What was this? Right. No. You can make all kinds of stuff. There's like stews and other things. You can cook other stuff real slow. That's the whole idea. Okay. Okay. So technically speaking, it's best to take it off the fire if you're going to serve stuff out of it. But if you couldn't, as long as it's fully cooked, you could serve out of it. Just don't stir it. Don't move it around. So like if you put kishka in it, don't stir the kishka into it. If you put anything, just don't stir it. Okay, don't stir it. It's on the fire. And try not to serve. Try to serve or stir on the fire. Moving on. Same matzo balls, same soup pot. Take it off the fire. Now you can throw all the matzo balls in the world that you want to. You can throw whatever you want to in here. As long as it's been cooked before Shabbos, throw it in there. Okay, now you're going to have one problem. It's all cold. It's going to make your soup colder. That's fine. You do that. Question is, if it's so cold you want to heat it back up again, well, then you are actually going to you could potentially have a problem. So just be careful when you're doing that. Just so you know, you can do it. Try not to cool it down, because then you're going to have one set of, you're going to definitely have the Shulchan Aruch mad at you. Okay. So again, so another possible place for the matzah balls to go is if you go ahead and pour your soup into a bowl. Definitely okay to put your matzah balls in there. Now, so those are matzah balls, right? Or let's say you had, a big pot of meatballs and you threw meatballs in there. Same thing. Things that were cooked, you throw more cooked stuff. You throw matzah balls in your meatballs. You throw meatballs in your soup. You do whatever you want, as long as it's all been cooked. That's okay. What you can't do is throw croutons and other things that have been baked, or other types of, or dip your bread into a Clich Rishon, because we talked about before that cooking things and baking things are two different methods of achieving the same goal. So you can't mix the two on Shabbos. So you can't throw bread into the Clich Rishon. Right? Don't know why you'd want to, but so you wanted to anyway. Let's say you want to serve people in a French baguette bowl on Shabbos. You shouldn't do that, because you're going to cook the dough on the inside on Shabbos by pouring it in there. It would be preferable to put the soup into a Clich Sheni, okay? Because then a Clich Sheni, the Talmud basically says Clich Sheni Mavashel, that the bowl into which the hot food is now put doesn't cook the same way, right? Shall be good, but it's not. Why? Because there are certain things that cook in minimal amounts of heat, like an egg or certain types of fish, that if you apply minimal amounts of heat to them, they'll cook. And sometimes even certain amounts of acid. I forget which one it is, which type of fish dish that it is, that you either just you cook it by I think halibut cooks really easily. So I think if you just pour hot water over it, or you let it sit in lime juice, and salt. And certain ones that if you just, even though they're sitting in something acidic, they will cook all the way through, even though they're not cooked. So a small amount of heat will basically take them from raw to edible. And so you've made a change even with a small amount of heat. And therefore, with the small amount of heat that would be pouring out of the Clich Rishon, you would be cooking them, and you would be cooking them on Shabbos. Even though you haven't used the fire, you have used something that's been heated with the fire, so it's an extension of the fire, and therefore would be cooking on Shabbos. If you left it out in the sun and it cooked, it's not a problem, because that's not a normal cooking. But this could potentially be a problem. So here's where our friend the ladle comes in. So if you ladle the soup out, the ladle is our friend. I don't have a Google effect for a ladle. Okay, that would be really great if I could hold my hand like this and a little ladle just like appeared. Okay. Or I could just grab a ladle. A Google Draw. There we go. So if you take the ladle creates this sort of binary position where it's not Clich Rishon, because it's not coming from there. It's through the auspices of a second. But it's not really a Clich Sheni because it went in and didn't go back out. So as long as you have a ladle that you're ladling out regularly into soup bowls, you basically make your soup bowl one level less than normal Clich Sheni. So because it's really considered a Clich Shlishi. So it was like this. It's somewhere in between, because it didn't get the food directly from the soup bowl, the original soup pot. Excuse me. So it actually makes it easier to use your soup bowls on Shabbos, because then you can dip your bread into it, because there's no concern that the heat in the bowl is going to cook the bread or anything else that you add to it. So even things like adding salt and spices, no concern about cooking them on Shabbos, because when you ladle out the soup, you're going to make the bowl into only a quasi Clich Sheni, partial Clich Shlishi. So it's like not total Clich Sheni, not total Clich Shlishi, but everyone will be happy to basically say you've cooled it off enough by multiple transfers to go ahead and put bread and other such things into your soup pot. That's a good question. There's a question over here. Is Shakshuka a possible Shabbos morning meal? Yes, you would have to cook all of it before Shabbos. and then you would probably just leave it in the frying pan, and then you could warm it, since it'll probably be dry. For the most part, shakshuka that I've had, if you get it dry, where there's no more liquid in it, you can get shakshuka pretty dry. Almost like, you don't think so? Okay. It's not shakshuka anymore, right? Yeah, so I don't know that you could heat it up. If you get it dry, then yeah. If you made it almost like, what's that? If you can make it like a frittata, then you could heat it up again. A frittata. It's not shakshuka, but if you make shakshuka like a frittata, it's not. It's a frittata, but it's like a frittata with lots of tomatoes and just make shakshuka pizza. Okay, how would you do that?
Well, before Shabbos, you make pizza.
Yeah.
And instead of tomato sauce, you put like shakshuka stuff, and then you put eggs on, and you cook the eggs 5 minutes in the oven.
Right.
And then you can heat it up later.
Heat it on Shabbos. Okay, so there you go. Shakshuka pizza. Okay. Okay, so there we go. Shakshuka pizza is the solution. All right. So again, for everybody that didn't catch that, you take your dough on the bottom, pita or laffa, Trader Joe's. Okay, Trader Joe's pizza dough. Okay, and then you make your pizza. You put your shakshuka stuff, put your eggs on top, bake it. Bam. As long as it's dry, it's okay. There's no liquid. As long as it's liquid, it's okay. So, and I was gonna say that's how you can make pizza on Shabbos too. Same thing. You make the pizza enough, and the liquid basically burns off. You could do that. Okay, that was awesome. See, that's why we have classes, so that we get great ideas like that. Let's see. Okay, so let's see. We talked about that type of stuff. So basically, that's going to be most of your issues with soup. So it doesn't matter what soup you have. Let's say you had, a minestrone soup, and you want to add more noodles. You could add the noodles later. If you cook noodles separately, as long as they've been cooked, you could put them into the Clich. There are lots of different applications for this. We don't need to go into every example right now. If someone else wants to think of something and have a question about it, just let me know. But you can't take something that's been baked and then put it into the Clich Shabbos. Okay. And so we were kind of doing F and G together over here, which is which food cannot be cooked in contact with other various levels of cooking. So let's say you have hot food, like hot chicken, hot meat, whatever it is, and everyone loves to eat ketchup or barbecue sauce with these hot foods. Not all hot foods come necessarily with enough flavoring, especially if you're under the age of 10. Everything must contain ketchup. So and someone at some point, I don't know what they did before the age of ketchup. I'm assuming children were just simply left to fend for themselves. But now we have ketchup. The world's now a better place. What?
My son would definitely agree with that.
Okay, good. Yeah, so anyway, so the real question is, you have hot food, right? That goes so that can you put ketchup with that hot food? Here's the issue. There's no fluid dynamics by solid foods. So if it's hot and you put it onto a plate, it's going to be pretty much the same temperature on the inside. The internal temperature is pretty much the same. It doesn't get affected by the plate. When you dry heat something, the heat has to go all the way in, and then it gets to the center. There's an internal temperature. Then the heat has to then radiate back out. So the inside is going to always be hotter than the outside. So it functions almost like a heat source. So if you take liquid and put it on top of that, you're in effect cooking it. And so it's therefore rabbinically prohibited to pour liquid on top of it. But things like ketchup and barbecue sauce and so on are considered enough of a liquid to actually affect the internal temperature of these things. It's best to put it on the side and slice it and cut it in so it cools off a little bit. But for the most part, thick things like that shouldn't be a problem. It's best to not try to pour like cold water or cold whatever on your hot meat or hot dry baked things. Like for example, it'd be probably best not to put like a slice of margarine on a hot baked potato that you cook out on Shabbos, just in case you're going to actually get the margarine to rise above the level of the oxalate as well, just as an example. Let's see over here, what else? Oh, and making tea. So let's talk about making tea. we're gonna wrap up with making tea thing over here. So making tea, the problem with tea is generally made by leaving the tea bags out in the air to dry out, and so they've never been cooked, and so therefore potentially could cook very easily. So the concept of Clich sort of became a solution later on. The first solution for making tea on Shabbos was to make tea essence. Basically was take hot water, pour all over your tea leaves, make a very concentrated tea thing, tea essence, people can call it that. And so you had tea concentrate, and then you would add hot water to your tea concentrate and sugar and all other things on Shabbos, because basically the water was already cooked, and then when you add water to it, it's not going to get, when you add hot water to the essence, you don't want the essence to be above the Yatzaledespo. Or if you want hotter tea, then you put your tea essence on the blech to keep the water hot, so you can get it above the Yatzaledespo. But basically, one suggestion was to just make very potent tea concentrate. Some people do that. So my custom is not to do that. A lot of people follow the custom of Rav Moshe Feinstein, which is that Clich, that third level of cooking is not cooking at all. And so therefore, as long as you basically do the following, you have a hot water pump or a hot water urn. You dispense the water from the hot water urn into a second container, and then pour water from that second container into a third one. That will be your teacup. Insert your tea bag and allow it to steep for 3 to 4 minutes, depending on your recommendation on the side of your tea bag. That is perfectly okay. At that point already, even though the water is still hot, it's not cooking the tea. And so as long as you're avoiding cooking the tea, then it's okay to do that on Shabbos. And so just to wrap up this first part of the lesson over here, hold on, I have another question over here. That's fine. No. Okay. So just to wrap up this first installment of the of this class, we covered tonight what is cooking and what is baking. That there are different levels of being cooked, and there's fully cooked, there's partially cooked. We talked about insulating foods, and that there's still a problem of cooking things even for edible raw foods, non-foods, and for water. We talked about issues of cooking again or reheating, and we just discussed different levels of heat and whether that retention applies for every single status change, and we gave some examples of permitted uses and not permitted uses, and how to get permitted uses of different levels of heat retention. So if does anybody have any questions, otherwise we will call it an evening. Okay. All right. Great. Thank you everyone for coming out. And
I had a question.